Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Thanks for joining me for my first show on Blogging Heads. I'm Sarah Posner. I'm senior editor at Religion Dispatches. And joining me today is Sarah Wildman. Sarah is a widely published journalist on the intersection of culture and politics and history and memory, and she's worked in Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. She's currently a columnist for PBS, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, The Guardian, The New Republic, many different places. And I invited her to join me today because I wanted to talk about Middle East policy and the presidential campaign, and Middle East policy in the United States, and how the role of religion and religious ideology plays in that, both for Jews and for evangelical Christians, and also for Jews in Israel. So to start us off a little bit, I thought maybe we would talk about what has been framed as a war on religion in the presidential campaign in the past week or two is something I think that's distracting us, or distracting the media from some of these foreign policy questions. We've been focusing a lot, and I myself have been writing a lot about the brouhaha over the contraception coverage, and the Republicans claim that Obama is waging a war on religion, and in particular, a war on the Catholic Church. But underneath the surface, there's a lot of other religious talk by the Republicans on the campaign trail pertaining to foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And I think right now the central focus is Iran. And maybe you can talk a little bit about there's been a lot of discussion about Iran, whether Israel should strike Iran's nuclear capabilities, whether the U.S. should back Israel if it does that. And there's been a lot of discussion about that by foreign policy analysts and national security reporters. Maybe you can do a little summary of how that's played out in the past couple of weeks.
So, right. I mean, I think that you've laid out a lot there, and I've obviously been following the contraceptive debate as well, very, very closely. But I think, I mean, if we're going to start with Iran, we have to think about it on two levels. One is the actual threat. I mean, and the perception of threat. And you and I have talked about that. It's hard for us to assess, right? I mean, what the nuclear capabilities of Iran are or are not.
Right.
And obviously experts on the ground in Israel and here in the United States are differ on it. And so there's sort of two questions, and I think this will get into stuff we'll talk about later as well, which is there's sort of the mythical threat and the actual threat, and then there's the idea of Iran and the reality of Iran. And to some degree, our conversations haven't been really dealing with reality at all. I mean, they've sort of been in this sort of mythical place of existentialism and what that means both for Israel going forward and what it means for the United States going forward. The Bush administration made arguments that have sounded very around Iraq that sound very similar to what we're hearing around Iran right now, and that's something I think that a lot of columnists have been talking about. Mike Tomasky at The Guardian and Neil Ferguson at The Guardian. I mean, at Daily Beast. We're both arguing over this, and I think what's interesting is that what we see with Iran is that there's great differences between the experts on the ground. I mean, you see that the Israeli military and intelligence officials are not sold on whether or not Iran is this existential threat to
Israel.
To Israel, right? To Israel. But what you're seeing that mutated in some way by the candidates here in the United States, by the Republican candidates. Using Iran as a kind of wedge issue to bash Obama on not being strong on certain foreign policy issues, or not acting in time, even though they're sort of ignoring an entire body of evidence. That's kind of not just quibbling, but that's really questioning whether or not going to war is the right choice. And it's not just about going to war; it's what if Israel strikes Iran? It's not clear at all that they can actually cripple the country's nuclear capabilities. So it's both is the case for war being made appropriately, and is it being made too blithely by, the Neil Fergusons? Is it being made too easily? It sounds so easy to go to war. Why don't we just do it? We'll take them out. And at the same time, there's this question of, are we really, if the case for war is made, is it even possible to do what people are saying they can do? Because of course, Iran paid attention to the Iraqi example of the early 80s when Israel took out the Osirak nuclear facility,
right.
With one big strike. Of course, that's not possible in Iran. So I think we have these two issues here. One is, what is the threat, and secondly, if there is a threat, how would they even address it? And so, there's been all this debate in the foreign policy community about whether or not Israel is primed. I mean, I'm sure you saw these things that I thought were sort of amusing. People saying, please don't bomb until Madonna plays at the end of May so we don't lose our Madonna tickets. There's been almost like a farcical version of this as well in Israel.
Right.
I don't know if you saw, there was a Samsung commercial that was created in Israel, which apparently got Samsung in a lot of trouble in Tehran, which showed a group of, Mossad agents dressed as Muslim women. I mean, the whole ad is insanely offensive. I mean, it's such a 10-year, but shows a group of so-called Mossad agents who stumble upon another Mossad agent who's obviously overseeing, or watching what's happening with Tehran. And they see that he has a Samsung tablet because he's so bored trying to figure out what's happening on the ground. And they say, what's this application? And they click it, and they blow up something in the distance, and it says, oops, another unexplained explosion in Iran, which is, of course, a joke about all these Iranian nuclear scientists who seem to be getting knocked off. And in fact, a lot of Israelis were offended by it as well, because they said, this is not going to be an easy, safe or funny war if it takes place. And the fact that we are joking about it shows that it somehow has become, it's sort of superseded its impact in Israeli society. It's become this joke. It's as though they already have won, when of course, if God forbid they go to war, I mean, you're talking about potential, nuclear genocide on both sides. I mean, it's
potentially
right. It is atrocious to think about. So it's not funny, and yet, of course, it's become the fact that people are talking about it in terms of Madonna tickets and Samsung tablets. I don't know.
Well, I think that could be partially because some of the discussion does take on a sort of cartoonish quality to it. If you focus too much on the sort of left behind-ish apocalyptic showdown, which doesn't seem real, which, has Jesus riding in on a white horse, and, it's not portrayed in any kind of serious theological way. It's, portrayed literally like this cartoonish episode where he comes to save the day in this kind of comic book sort of showdown. I think that may be having an impact on people's ability to take the whole thing seriously, or maybe it impacts their desire to make light of something because it does potentially have some serious consequences for people's real lives, as opposed to the cartoonish lives in some of these apocalyptic portrayals of what would happen if Israel strikes Iran and sets off some Armageddon war.
Right.
But I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the way the Republican presidential candidates are playing this. We hear a lot of talk of comparing this to 1938, and is that playing at all in Israel? This idea that Iran is a new Hitler that may cause a second Holocaust?
Well, I think that's, I think you have two competing tropes, right? I mean, you do have this anxiety around the existential threat, and you hear that Holocaust imagery. I mean, it's also coming out of Netanyahu. It's not just from the Republican candidates. I mean, the Republican candidates are almost sort of reading off of a Likud playbook, right? I mean, it is something that the far right in Israel, or the center right even, has pushed an idea of it being a second Holocaust, that he's a Hitler, that he is, one of a string of people who've tried to annihilate the Jews over, centuries, it's like the song on Passover, they sing,
Right.
Yehi Shamda, which is, that in every generation someone has risen up to try to destroy us, but God comes and saves us, right?
Right.
And I think that definitely plays. But there's another piece, which is that you have a number of columnists. For example, from 972, you have Larry Durfner, who used to be at the Jerusalem Post, saying, I understand that there's one side of Israeli society which is pushing that this is 1936, but there's a whole other group of policy and intelligence officials who are saying this is not that at all, and we need to be paying attention to both sides of it and stop thinking that it's something that's quite as clear cut as as Nazi ideology of 1936 or 38 or even
Right.
or even 33.
And so, that's some of these discussions around, do you believe that Iran is an existential threat to Israel, are very bound up in not necessarily foreign policy realities, but Jewish identity. And do you believe this about the existential threat? And if you don't, do you really, are you really taking seriously the threats to Israel? And what does that mean for your Jewish identity if you're not taking threats to Israel as seriously as you supposedly should be?
Right.
I mean, does that get discussed in Israel? I mean, are the 972 columnists sparking a conversation about that in Israel that's sort of free of accusations about not being Jewish enough or not being pro-Israel enough?
Well, I think actually we sort of have to tease it apart. I don't think that the 972 people or Jerusalem Post or Haaretz columnists are discussing about being Jewish enough or pro-Israel enough, because remember, that's really a much more American concept, right? I mean, once you're in Israel, I think that the idea of being Jewish enough or pro-Israel enough, the nature of that conversation really changes, right? I mean,
I think that's an important point, though, because I think that's lost on a lot of people in the United States.
Right. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that there's a sense of, within Israeli society, a debate about, what Israel means and what this threat means. But remember, I think it's also tied up in the idea of what the future looks like in terms of peace or lack of peace. And, we sort of have to tease apart a couple of different things here. I think it's not just a question of Iran. I mean, there's a debate going on, I think, within the Israeli newspapers and within Israeli society about whether or not there's going to be an attack, preemptive attack, a non-preemptive attack, whatever. And there's sort of this anxiety, it seems, just from reading the daily papers, that there's a sense of almost inevitability about it. And I don't think that's
that Israel would attack Iran.
Yeah, that there's some. That's why this debate around the Madonna tickets. And then I've even seen sort of Facebook chatter among people that I know who are columnists saying things like, oh, well, there's going to be a bar mitzvah in May or June, and should the guests book their tickets or not? There's this strange sort of almost resignation around it, which is interesting. And of course, there's a broad spectrum of Israeli politics, which is reflected in the Israeli media environment. And so it depends on where you're reading. I think, as I said, on 972, it's, there's a strong case against war, and then as you sort of, that's the far left of the Israeli media spectrum, and then as you sort
we're
of
talking about the website 972, the web magazine 972,
right? Exactly,
right.
And so 972 is to the far left. It's to the left of Haaretz, let's say. And so you have Haaretz at 972 where they're debating this, and Haaretz, there was a piece yesterday or 2 days ago around if Iranian intelligence officials want to learn anything, they just have to come to Israel, and everybody's talking about it, if they can hear all the strategies already. They were sort of almost joking about how Israel's not keeping anything quiet. And then as you move, towards the right wing of the, of the Israeli media perspective, you have more and more of a case for war, that this is, a dramatic threat, and they should take it very seriously. And in fact, Israel should, to some degree, I guess I kind of wonder, given that, if you go back to the Daily Beast and Niall Ferguson's conversation the other day,
right,
which was, he likens it to the moments before the 6-Day War, and I actually think what's interesting about that is that also is appealing back to a period when Israeli foreign policy seemed more black and white, right? I mean, I think that there seemed much more clarity around the threat to Israel, how Israel should go, the sort of idea of Israel as these tiny heroes. And in some ways, it's almost, by looking at it back into the 6-Day War context, it almost allows this mythical Israel idea to be reinvigorated in a way that I think it no longer exists. Both because of
right. That's really interesting. I read Ferguson's piece and thought it was curious that he was making the 6-Day War analogy in light of the fact that there were so many American conservative pundits who were making the 1938 analogy. But I hadn't thought about it in the way that you just framed. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think that this is the question. I guess what you and I were talking about earlier, that what are we more qualified to discuss? I don't know how close they are in terms of their, uranium enrichment. I don't know.
Right.
I can't speak to that. But I can speak to what this looks like in terms of the future of Israel and the way that Israel has positioned itself or not positioned itself globally. And in a strange way, I think if Iran is an existential threat to Israel, it allows Israel a kind of purity of purpose that in some ways has gotten lost since the first and second intifada, and maybe even, you might go back further and say since the first Lebanon War, 1982, when everything started to seem much more gray in terms of politics in the region and in terms of military intervention in the region. Since 1982, Israel has not seemed to be quite as the choices that they've made have not been nearly so clear or nearly so easy to defend, right? So the 6-Day War seemed like Egypt and the neighbors were about to attack, and this was a way in which that we could support Israel because Israel was going to be wiped out. And I'm not saying that Iran doesn't want to wipe out Israel. I'm just not sure that it's quite as imminent or quite as clear as. And again, I don't want to get into this idea of what the actual nuclear threat is because
right.
I can't. But I do wonder about this idea of kind of reclaiming the mantle of David and Goliath and sort of switching that up and this is the Jewish homeland and by creating this Holocaust imagery. Whenever you use Holocaust imagery, you got to go back to this idea of Jewish exceptionalism, Israeli exceptionalism. That this is the only place in the world that can allow Jews to exist, and that it stands for something, and it's something that appeals to me. It's something that I grew up with on some level, right? It doesn't appeal to me, the idea of the existential threat to Israel, but the purity of purpose appeals to me, and I think that that's something that's useful politically, and might not be grounded exactly in intelligence, and so I guess that's something to tease apart.
Right.
So
I think that. Like you're saying, it's not so clear cut because we don't know, and there's conflicting intelligence. If we are to believe the various pieces of intelligence that we're getting out of Iran, there's conflicting intelligence about, or my understanding is there's conflicting intelligence about how far along the Iranians are in making a nuclear weapon or not.
Right.
And I guess the other question is whether they would actually use it on Israel, because they have considerations for themselves about the consequences to them if they were to do that. So, I don't think that Ahmadinejad is necessarily a rational actor here, but he's not the only actor here.
Right.
And it's not even clear. I don't think that he's the principal actor here.
Right.
From the Iranian standpoint. But I wonder if it's more complicated. It's a more complicated question. And I think that you're saying that for Israelis, it's perhaps a more complicated question than the Republican presidential candidates would make it seem here. And I think that the mythology of Israel that you're talking about is also something that plays well to American non-Jews, which is why you see a candidate like Newt Gingrich or Rick Santorum talking about it. And oddly enough, in Gingrich's case, helped out with some not insubstantial amount of money from a Jewish American who's very interested in promoting this mythology of what Israel is. And that, I mean, we're talking about Sheldon Adelson here.
Right. And I think that, I think that there's a couple of different things that we can talk about here. One is Adelson and the presence of, kind of promoting with huge amounts of money a specific view on Israel, and then also the going back to that word cartoonish, the cartoonish way in which the Republican candidates have talked about Israel and talked about the future of the state and relations with the Palestinians and the relationship between the state and the United States. I mean, so. There's one of the things that all of them have talked about. I mean, Gingrich has campaigned on this idea that he would move the American embassy on his first day in office from Tel Aviv to
one of
Jerusalem.
his many executive orders that he said he would sign.
Right. Well, and to be fair, what's interesting is that, of course, Clinton campaigned on this and Bush campaigned on this. I mean, it's been something that people have used over time, but no one has ever done. And no one's ever done it because, of course, the idea of moving the embassy is something that would start some sort of conflagration. What's amazing is a couple of weeks ago, I met with Danny Seidman, who is a lawyer in Jerusalem who works on settlement issues and kind of advises peace negotiators on what's possible as the settlements continue to go. And he takes issues to court. I mean, he runs an NGO that deals with territorial concerns from the left, of course. But he's very measured and he's very, very pro-state solution, two-state solution. But he told an amazing anecdote about Newt Gingrich in 1998. So Gingrich was still the Speaker of the House at the time. And I tried to confirm this with the Gingrich campaign, and they didn't get back to me. Gingrich was still Speaker of the House at the time, and Olmert was mayor of Jerusalem. He went on to become prime minister. He was not yet prime minister. Gingrich visited Jerusalem, and Olmert wanted him to come to a ceremonial sort of first shovel in the ground at the Allenby compound, which is the place where the U.S. Embassy would go, if Jerusalem was ever, had final status accords and we were actually ever to move our embassy to Jerusalem. And activists on the ground heard about it and said, things are too dicey right now. There's no way. If Gingrich goes to this and 40 journalists and photojournalists show up and there's a big, shovel in the ground ceremony for the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, it will start a conflagration, a little bit like, what Sharon did a couple years later by taking his Temple Mount walk.
At the Temple Mount.
Right. So Gingrich, apparently this concern got up to the White House and Clinton called Gingrich and said, you can't, please, for the love of God, don't go to this. Please don't do this. Do something else, whatever. And Gingrich apparently said, I respect the executive branch is in charge of foreign policy for my country. And if the executive branch is telling me that, this is amazing, I think. If the executive branch is telling me this, I won't do it. And so as a sop to Olmert, instead of going to this shovel in the ground ceremony for the embassy, he instead decided to go to see the beginning of the Har Homa settlement, which of course was in and of itself controversial, but, was less so, right? I mean, marginally less so. So Olmert takes Gingrich in a van with some security people out to see the beginning, first stones of Har Homa, which is now built. But on the way back, he tells the van driver he wants to make a detour. And they see up in front of them all these journalists waiting. And Gingrich realizes what's up because Olmert says, I've decided we're going to see the shovel in the ground ceremony anyway. And Gingrich says, stop the van. If you don't stop the van, I'm going to get off and walk back to my hotel. I'm going to get on a plane immediately. And before I do, I'm going to hold a press conference saying that you tried to force confrontation around the embassy that I refused to participate in. And Seidman tells this anecdote. I mean, look at this. This is 1998. Gingrich who understands that the embassy issue is something that could start, an intifada. And now he's campaigning on it. And the situation has not become less delicate. I mean, by any stretch. There's no final status agreement on Jerusalem. And there's no movement on the idea that, moving an embassy is the right choice right now. And yet, Gingrich is no longer kind of paying attention to that, in part because he's being, surely in part because he's being bankrolled by someone who, has the most extreme position on, Israel's rightness in the region. And
I think it's both. It's not just Adelson,
right,
but it's that Gingrich has, for some time now, been pandering to and making friends with American Christian Zionists who also essentially, themselves campaign on it. They talk about it a lot. People like John Hagee talk about the necessity of moving the embassy to Jerusalem, among other things. Hagee 6 years ago wrote a book about how America should engage in a preemptive strike against Iran to save Israel from Iran.
Because
these dynamics have been going on between Gingrich and the American evangelical right at the same time that he is seeking money from and support from Adelson. And Adelson doesn't just play a role in shaping opinion here in the U.S. about issues pertaining to Israel. He does so in Israel, too. He's American. His wife, I think, is Israeli.
Right. Yeah, his wife is Israeli.
And his wife has also contributed to the super PAC that was supporting Gingrich.
Right. I think she put in her own $5 million. The second $5 million came from Miriam. Right. No, that's right. I mean, in 2007, Adelson created a free daily newspaper called Israel Hayom, Israel Today. And by 2010, so 3 years later, it had surpassed Yediot Achronot, the most read newspaper in Israel, and become the most read. So Israel Hayom is now the most read newspaper in Israel. It is distinctly political. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, they were exposed that one of their columnists was actually on the payroll of the prime minister's office. And people feel that in 2009, when Netanyahu was reelected, that Israel Hayom played a big role in that, to pushing him forward. And they certainly have changed. I mean, Israel society in general has moved to the right, and Israel Hayom is even further to the right, and it's participating, it's enabling, and it's promoting that move. To some degree, part of the problem, of course, it's not entirely, Israel's just moving to the right, Israel's just moving to the right in a vacuum. I mean, look, Israeli society has had two intifadas. The first one, perhaps less so than the second, had this impact, but by the second, beginning in 2000, the waves of suicide bombings completely traumatized Israeli society. People, people felt like they'd been on board with the Oslo process, that they had done everything. No, we can quibble about whether or not Israel had done enough and whether or not Israel had offered enough. But I think as average Israelis felt that here they were offering all sorts of concessions, and what do they get in return? An inability to go to restaurants at night, and a total terror at going out in the street, taking a bus. I mean, Israelis mostly take buses, right? It's not like there are trains in Israel, but primarily Israelis take buses. And there was a time when people felt they couldn't get on a bus. I mean, and it wasn't even just buses, because it was the cars next to them. I mean, it was completely upended your ability to live a normal life. And I think that it's important to recognize that you have kids now. I mean, if you think about it, so that was 2000. So you have kids now who are coming of age, and they've only ever known a time when either there were bombings or there was a security wall. So once these bombings took place, you no longer had any access to knowing Palestinians, because Palestinians were more and more and eventually almost entirely barred from working in Israel, because the security wall went up and work permits, dried up. And so you no longer had any interactions between normal Palestinians and normal Israelis. And all you had were these big images of terror and violence.
But at the same time that this has been going on, there have been decreasing prospects for peace with the Palestinians. So it's like this, it's creating a never-ending conflict.
Right, of course. Well, I mean, there's never any conflict, because you no longer have any access to the idea of what a post-conflict period would look like. Nobody feels invested in peace anymore because the status quo became something they could live with. I mean, I think that that's part of the problem. I think that the majority of Israelis feel like, well, the status quo is easier than dealing with the idea of peace, because what does it even mean to have a, militarized neighbor that they still believe wants to crush them in some way. So
how did Adelson's paper become so widely read? Was it a function of what he was printing in it played to the anxieties of everyday Israelis, or was it because he had the money to invest in marketing these ideas? Because clearly he has a lot of money to throw around.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of getting any kind of publication anywhere, getting it traction, requires
cash,
money behind publicizing it and making it seem like it's something that you should be reading.
Right.
I mean, how do you have a sense of whether he was actually tapping into something that Israelis wanted to be reading, or whether he played a role in pushing this out to them?
I think it's a combination, right? I mean, there was actually a law floated against dumping because nobody has to buy it. It's easy to read, it's cheap. And in fact, there were, laws proposed that they should have to charge, which is interesting because that means that there's some concern that literally just its very proliferation has enabled sort of a dissemination of ideas, right? So I think that there's that. But I think the second piece of it is that because it's so widely, it kind of feeds on itself. Israelis, especially after the second intifada, no longer really wanted to read about what was happening over the Green Line. So I have this piece coming out this week in The Nation about 9/7/2, and I spoke to a lot of Israeli journalists about what happened after the after the first intifada too, which is basically that no newspapers can't sell news based on what's happening over the Green Line. People don't want to hear about settlements. They don't want to hear about that settlements are bad. They don't want to hear about atrocities taking place. They don't want to hear about ambulances being stopped at checkpoints. They want to hear nice news about their soldiers doing good things. They don't want to hear about soldiers doing bad things in villages. They don't want to hear about Friday protests where tear gas is used and old women vomit from it. They don't want to hear about it. They don't, it's sort of people said to me, well, Americans don't want to read about Iraq all the time, and it's similar. I think there's some validity to that. I don't think that we've stopped reporting about Iraq, but I think it's something a little bit akin to what's happened with the way that American local news and even broadcast news plays to an American audience, right? What do we know about? I mean, what do we care about? And we don't pay that much attention to what's happening on the ground, in Iraq or Afghanistan, or as much as we should, for example.
But, do you think it seems to me that the Israelis risk being seen by non-Israelis, by being seen by others around the world as being, even others who are sensitive and sympathetic to the fact that Israelis have been the victims of terror, right? That they risk being seen as being completely either insensitive or oblivious to the fact that, the realities of the occupation, basically, put it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be a risky positioning for the Israelis, even if it's something that's understandable in light of their circumstances. And that Adelson is somehow enabling that, and that's not good. He claims to be wanting to be an advocate for and a defender of Israel, but that seems to me to be a very risky thing to do to Israelis, to enable their putting their blinders on to the conflict, and therefore decreasing the chances of. I actually think the peace process is completely undone at this point. But
right. The question is whether or not the two-state solution has lost its it's
right.
It's
right. I mean, and obviously, I mean, we know that that's Adelson's goal.
Right.
But, I think that there's a debate about whether this is this, the whole question of, is this good for the Jews? Is this good for Israel?
Right.
And it sort of seems from my perspective that
it's bad for the Jews.
It's not. And the other thing I wanted to, while we were talking about Adelson and Gingrich and the presidential campaign here, I think that Adelson is also, whether this is just entirely unintentional or he views it as a unimportant consequence of funding Gingrich's super PAC. Although, it seems now that perhaps he's not going to be doing that now that Gingrich clearly isn't going to win the nomination.
Right.
But I think he's enabling some of this Christian Zionism that actually promotes evangelizing to Jews, or at least promoting an alliance between evangelicals and Jews that requires Jews to look past the fact that the evangelicals think that they need to be converted before the end times, because otherwise, they're going to either perish during the tribulation or during the...
Well, to some degree, I think both sides are using each other, right? I mean, the evangelicals are using Jews to get to the end time, and to some degree, Jews are using evangelicals as a support. Yeah, as a support at a time. And
so when I was in Florida covering the primary, I went to First Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. It's a huge Southern Baptist church. I mean, to call it a mega church doesn't even capture how big it is. It's 4 city blocks of various church buildings. And they were having a pastor's conference that weekend, the weekend before the Florida primary. And the closing speaker of the conference was Joel Rosenberg, who for a long time has been promoting the issue of Iran's existential threat to Israel and the possibility of U.S. war or Israeli war against Iran. And he was the closing speaker, and Gingrich paid a visit, had to have known that this was the closing speaker. And Gingrich paid a visit to First Baptist. He didn't speak, but he sat in the audience while Rosenberg was speaking. And Rosenberg is a Messianic Jew.
Yeah.
He was raised Jewish, but
I have such trouble.
found Jesus. He says when he was 7 and his Orthodox Jewish father let him go to vacation Bible school. But it was just so odd to me. I was sitting in the pews at First Baptist with knowing that Gingrich was in the audience there and knowing that Gingrich was essentially being kept alive in Florida by Adelson.
Right.
And he was sitting there listening to Rosenberg tell a sanctuary full of Southern Baptist pastors that they really needed to work harder on evangelizing the Jews and bringing the gospel to the Jews.
Right.
And he said so many just unbelievable things in the course of this sermon. I'll give one example.
Yeah.
He said, certainly you all know somebody Jewish. You all have an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor.
That's so wrong.
And so I'm sitting there thinking, okay, so Gingrich is just sitting here listening to this. And, Adelson... I just didn't know what to say. It was one of those things where you're just thinking, this is just,
It's funny. It makes me wonder, actually, now that we're circling back to this idea, but, this existential threat. Many years ago, I don't know, more than a decade ago, I went with Gershom Kornberg. He wrote this book on the end times, end of days.
Right.
And I worked on a piece about the Temple Mount Faithful, which is a group that wants to blow up the Temple Mount to bring sort of the second coming, to rebuild the temple and bring the second coming of the Messiah, or first, depending on who you're talking to. It's interesting because, of course, they know that it would bring, a kind of apocalyptic war, and to some degree, I wonder if the Iran threat allows for that as well, right? It allows for a kind of outsider, whereas if God forbid, evangelicals or extremist Jews were to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which I please hope would never ever happen. That there's much more, sort of finger pointing. Whereas if it's an external force, it's an easier thing to say that this is the beginning of end times or something like that. I can see that as kind of linked. God, it's amazing that he was there. I mean, Messianic Jews to me seem to be so fringe and are so anathema to the Jewish community in the United States that, I mean, and anywhere. I mean, I think in Israel they're probably just seen in a sort of comical way, whereas in the United States I think they're seen as much more vaguely dangerous and slightly.
Yeah, it was odd. I actually thought that his biography seemed a little hard to believe. Because he talked about how his father was an Orthodox Jew and that his mother was a daughter of the American Revolution, but that he, Joel Rosenberg himself, considered himself to be Jewish because, notwithstanding the fact that, in Orthodox Judaism, your mother would have to be Jewish for you to be considered Jewish.
Right. Yeah.
And by, I guess, Israeli law, too. But he said, and this was another thing that he said that just shocked me. He said, well, I used the same standard that Hitler would have used to determine whether somebody was Jewish. And so by that standard, I considered myself to be Jewish.
Huh.
And still does. Like, he talks about it in the present tense, that he considers himself to be Jewish.
It's sort of funny because actually he would have been considered a Mischlinge. And because his father was... because his father was Jewish and his mother was not. Actually, I guess Hitler, that's true. Hitler was more concerned with Aryan fathers. But he would have had a special dispensation. It wouldn't have been sort of like in the first cut.
Right, but it was just odd to, even raise that as
yeah.
the standard that he uses himself to determine, to decide whether he's Jewish. And the fact that he still talks about being Jewish in the present tense, even though he is a believer in Jesus and considers Jesus Christ to be his Savior, and was, sermonizing to these Southern Baptist pastors about how they need to bring the gospel to the Jews. It was just, it was a pretty odd moment.
Yeah.
But I think that, to sort of wrap up on this Adelson stuff, I think that, from news accounts, it sounds like he's perhaps not going to be funding Gingrich's super PAC anymore and may move over to the Romney side.
Right.
And I think that if the way the polls are going right now, we are showing a sort of semi-surge for Santorum, and Santorum is not immune to these issues either. I mean, he has talked a lot about in terms of clash of civilization between Islam and Israel and between Islam and the United States, and has talked about the threat of Iran. So
right, I was going to say that. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that it gets back into this idea, and I don't think we've really touched on this enough, which is the ways in which the Iran threat kind of buys back into a strain of Islamophobia that's existed certainly in this country, since 9/11 in a much more overt way. I mean, maybe immediately after 9/11, a little less so, and then it's kind of had this kind of big push, especially that's been much more present and much more visible since the Cordoba Mosque controversy the summer before last. And I think that Santorum kind of speaks into this as well. And this strange way in which there's this conflation of an entire kind of scary Arab world that doesn't have any kind of real basis in reality, or the differences between each country, or the, age-old enmity between each of these. I mean, it's not like the Saudis and the Iranians like each other. So it's
right.
There's such a funny thing in which the candidates are kind of creating this massive Muslim menace, which doesn't connect to realities in the region, but it sort of feeds back into kind of using Islamophobia as a campaign trail tactic. And it's funny because it's something it's certainly since, I want to say, 2004. I can't remember. A number of years ago, I can't. Oop, I don't know what that was. Oops, sorry. Can we edit that out? Are you there?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what that was. So, I mean, I think what's interesting is that I lost my thought. Sorry, what was I just saying? What did I just say that right before we were talking about this Islamophobia?
The Islamophobia on the campaign trail that doesn't match up with the reality of the Islamic world.
Right. And I think that there's a way in which that's been exploited, and Santorum is sort of buying back into that. And I mean, each of them are, right? I mean,
yes.
but Santorum's quotes in general. I mean, in a funny way, it seems to me nobody has briefed them at all on the differences in the region, and it kind of feeds back into this kind of strange duality. One is that Islamophobia is seen as a decent campaign strategy, and
well, they're talking about somebody else's war on religion.
right, but also that not having any kind of real understanding of actual nuances in foreign policy is somehow seen as a strategy as well. That to me is completely peculiar. I mean, it's a little like, the ads that say, oh, and Mitt Romney also speaks French. There's this way in which understanding the world has become a liability in the Republican campaign, which I find to be completely bizarre. I mean, why would that be something you'd want in, the commander-in-chief of the country? Why would you not want him or her to have a group?
Well, I think it has to do with the demagoguing, the demagoguery they think is necessary to motivate their base. So you have to look at the base as having been schooled in this particular idea of American exceptionalism, which is very much rooted in the idea that the founding fathers intended America to be a Christian nation,
right.
And that we are a Christian nation, and that the secularists have somehow diminished that by, ruling that officially sanctioned school prayer is unconstitutional, and making up this whole idea of the separation of church and state. And that, they claim, has made us vulnerable to the threat of Sharia law,
right.
Oddly enough. Like, if they think that the liberals invented the separation of church and state, don't you think the liberals would be good at keeping Sharia law out? But anyway,
right.
That's just one of many inconsistencies in this argument, but it's definitely plays to this idea of America as a Christian nation, and that if we have this supposed threat from the outside of Sharia law, that's something that's not just a risk. That this cosmic battle of civilizations is not just a risk for the Israelis, but for our idea of America as well.
Right, but I also think that this idea of a kind of, I also think it buys into why Israel. I mean, it's partly because of Israel in and of itself, and it's also partly because it's the one non-Muslim actor in the Near East. So you can say, oh, we support them because they parallel our democratic ideals, and that's of course true. I mean, and that's actually a better argument. But I think that there's some part of it that's also about this, supporting the non-Muslims in the region. I think that there's, I think that speaks to...
But it's also, I think, for a lot of them, the role that they see Israel playing in biblical prophecy,
right,
that Israel plays this special role, and that God commanded them to love and protect and bless Israel, otherwise they would be cursed. So
right.
They're taught to believe that God is going to curse America if America doesn't quote unquote defend Israel.
Right.
So, but something that was interesting to me when I was out on the campaign trail, I was in Iowa and South Carolina and Florida, was how important these foreign policy issues, I don't even want to call them foreign policy issues, these foreign policy myths are to the Republican base, like people who are, very motivated, very conservative and very motivated to go out to campaign events
right.
or, presidential forums and things like that, was that I met a lot of people who really, really liked Ron Paul, liked everything Ron Paul had to stand for, but would not vote for him because of his foreign policy stance. Huh. And so it really shows that, this is a make or break issue for them.
Right.
That, as much as they may talk about, well, the deficit matters and, big government matters, and the most important thing that we have to do if we get a Republican in the White House is repeal Obamacare.
Right.
But judging from these voters' reactions to Ron Paul's foreign policy, it's a deal breaker.
Right.
That, they thought he was great on everything except that.
Right. I mean, and I think I think that's, I remember now what my other point was, which was that, what's interesting to me is that there's been this dissolution. I mean, Muslim voters were seen, certainly in 2000 as a potential new, pot of conservative voters. I mean, values voters. I mean, religious Muslims are much more, in line with sort of a conservative social value structure, or were seen to be. I mean, and certainly in the 2000 election, were seen to be as a potential new, base. And so it's interesting, this idea that has become, completely, that has pushed that out of the, it's completely pushed that away, that there's no commonality now on those social values issues and much more.
Well, I think that there's actually, a conflict going on within the conservative movement, right, where you have on the one side, people like Grover Norquist, who has really made an effort, is married to a Palestinian American, right, and has really made an effort to bring more Muslims into the conservative movement. So the iconic figures in this battle are, Grover Norquist and Frank Gaffney, who, has essentially been banished from the Conservative Political Action Conference because of his Islamophobia. Mm-hmm. Yet at the same time, there's a lot of Islamophobic stuff that goes on at CPAC.
Right.
So there's definitely there is a conflict within the base about this question of, we should be courting Muslim American voters versus, oh my God, the Muslims are scary and they're about to take over America.
Right, but Gingrich has been completely campaigning on this idea that Sharia law is encroaching. And it's like he's taken a page out of the European far-right playbook, and this idea that Sharia law, this is something.
Because I think that even though people, insiders like Norquist, have a better, more rational understanding of these issues, I think that the candidates know that the base reacts to this.
Right.
Do you really think that in his heart of hearts, Newt Gingrich thinks that Sharia law is a threat to America? It's
right. No, but I don't know. But I don't want to. I don't think Gingrich believes in much more than candidate Gingrich, really.
Right,
ultimately,
right.
And so if that's what's
right, exactly.
going to work for him, it's. He's masterful at sounding like, morally outraged by the, suggestion that he, that his life path has been, if anything, if not totally traditional and normative. So it's hard for, there's so many pieces for him. I can't really say.
Yeah.
Clearly he's switched because when he was a congressman, he was much more amenable to the idea of both a peace process and a kind of, universal values in ways that he doesn't seem to be anymore. So
yeah,
I don't know that that's so shocking. But I think what's interesting is that he's running as the true conservative, and he's the true conservative candidate, and that part and parcel with that is this anti-Sharia stuff, which seems to me just a total, kind of, it's, race baiting hysteria stuff. It's just
right. And also, the court and I can't remember what circuit it was, ruled that the Oklahoma law banning Sharia,
right,
or banning international law with the purpose of banning Sharia was unconstitutional.
Right.
So, they're going to persist, because of course that was an activist judge that ruled that. So how could you believe that that's a real American ruling?
Right.
So they're clearly, I think they're going to persist with it. I think the interesting thing over the next few weeks is going to be how much Santorum and Gingrich will push Romney, and also the possibility of Adelson funding will push Romney to be talking about these kinds of issues and framing them this way.
Right. And Romney has proved to be nothing if not malleable in his former positions.
Yes. I think he's proved that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, listen, it was great having this conversation with you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Okay. So talk again soon, I hope.